Okay. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional custodians of our land, Australia. The Gadigal of the Eora Nation are the traditional custodians of this place we now call Sydney. I hope everyone is well and enjoying some newfound freedoms. Today's presentation is by Dovi Seldowitz, and it's called Beyond the Brick and Mortar, 5 Unconventional Ways to Remember the Holocaust. As many of you are aware, for nearly the past 4 years, Courage to Care has been extremely fortunate to have Dovi employed as our Programs and Technology Officer. During this time, he successfully secured government and philanthropic grants for Courage to Care, developed the biannual community fundraising appeal, and has overseen the introduction of new technologies to assist Courage to Care's exhibition and classroom programs. Dovi's latest completed project is the production of new short films helping to promote Courage to Care to schools and the general community. Dovi is currently a PhD candidate, Sociology, received his BA Honours in Sociology and Anthropology at UNSW, and a rabbinical ordination from the Central Lubavitch Yeshiva in Brooklyn. His area of research concerns social change in religion, with close attention to the growth of women's leadership in Orthodox and Hasidic communities. Dovi received the University of New South Wales University Medal in Sociology and Anthropology 2020, and the Australian Sociological Association Honours Masters Award in 2020. We're extremely fortunate to have Dovi give this presentation this afternoon. Everyone will be muted while Dovi is talking, but we welcome questions and comments. I'm sure there'll be many. You can either type your question or comment into the chat function at any time during the presentation, or you can wait until the end and put up your hand, and we will organise you to talk directly. At the end, then there'll be the opportunity for a Q&A. We are recording this presentation, so it will be available for Courage to Care people who may not have been able to attend this afternoon. I'll pass you over now to Dovi. Thanks, Dovi.
Thank you, Kathy, for that very generous introduction. So by way of housekeeping, I again want to reiterate what Kathy said to encourage you that if you have any thoughts, comments, you can either jot it down, write it down in the chat now, or save it for the Q&A. We'll try, obviously, to accommodate everybody. And I do expect that because of the topic that we're talking today, that many of you will have some views on these issues. And so, of course, we'll welcome everything. So for today's presentation, Beyond the Brick and Mortar, Unconventional Ways to Remember the Holocaust, what I'm going to do is I will contrast what is seemingly the standard ways which we, as a Jewish community, memorialize the Holocaust, honor its memory, honor the memory of those who perished, honor the legacy of the survivors, all of those conventional ways that we normally treat this topic versus some new and unconventional ways. Now, I'm going to share PowerPoint in just a second, so if you don't mind, just one moment for me to do so. Okay. All right, so I think we're ready to begin. Now, can I just confirm that you're able all to see the screen now that I've put it in present mode? Everything good? Okay, good. All right, so today like I said, what we're going to talk about is the difference between conventional ways and unconventional ways we treat the Holocaust memory. And obviously, what is probably the most conventional ways? What are conventional ways we approach this, and what does it mean by conventional? I think there are 3. One is in terms of Holocaust museums and centers, both in Australia and around the world. memorials and monuments, various kinds, again, here in Australia and around the world. And finally, there are commemorative days, so Yom HaShoah and other such days. What makes these days conventional and what makes these kinds of memory making conventional is that they're fixed, literally, for monuments and for museums. They're literally cemented into the ground. And for commemorative days, it's a set fixed day once a year. And that's what I mean by conventional. It's something that becomes part of the common practice, something that we can expect to be reliably in one place, in either in one point of time during the year, or at one place, physical space that we can visit. And so this is what I mean by conventional. Unconventional, however, is going to be the inverse of this. And so they're not going to be fixed necessarily in place, either in time or space, or they are treated in sort of unexpected ways and seem to be more fluid in the way people approach it. So I'm going to start with unconventional way number one, which is going to be familiar to everyone here, and that is education. And so for a program like Courage to Care and many other such programs around the world which involve education as part of a program that involves telling people about the Holocaust in educational settings, what I'm treating this topic as a way to remember the Holocaust is that because although on the surface, the stated objective for these programs is that we are trying to educate either children or adults or other such people, and we're trying to offer some sort of lesson, I would suggest that behind the scenes, on a kind of, on a different level, on a non-obvious level, there is also a degree of memorialization taking place. So for example, in the case of Courage to Care or other similar sort of programs, the participation of individuals in such programs, whether they're directly participating or they're indirectly supporting these activities, or whether they're contributing towards the support of such activities, or they're promoting it, or they're otherwise valuing such a project in whatever way they are approaching it, they are also engaged in a kind of memory making and a kind of honoring of the memory of the Holocaust. That is, so just to recap what I'm saying here, I'm saying that although the stated objective of such programs is education, a kind of a latent or a non-obvious objective of these programs is to honor the Holocaust memory. And this is something that I'm sure many of you can freely comment on as we talk about. And to me, this is pretty easy to start with, which is why I'll jump to number two, travel and pilgrimage. So in terms of unconventional ways to approach the Holocaust, this is also fairly recent compared to some of the more older and established ways of Holocaust memory. So Holocaust monuments and memorials and museums took place immediately, began immediately after the war. In some areas, some other communities, such as Sydney, for example, the Sydney Jewish Museum was only built much more later in time, only decades after the war. But in terms of Yad Vashem and other such places, that's right away. Travel is another. Travel and pilgrimage is also a more recent and unconventional approach. And here it gets a little bit more multifaceted. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the March of the Living. So this is an event where young Jews from around the world go and travel to sites, concentration camp sites, most notably Auschwitz. And so what is happening here is a way to honor the Holocaust memory by way of travel. And almost, you can say, this has been suggested by other people in the past, other scholars and researchers, that it's almost like a sacred site, that we're treating this place as not simply, we're transforming the site of the concentration camp from a site of horror to now a sacred site, of a site of pilgrimage, almost. At least that's how this can be interpreted. And so you can argue that it's not merely a travel exercise. This is not merely a tourist attraction, but this is now a way to honor Holocaust memory in a very real and a very powerful way. And for some people, it may be even a greater experience than attending some of the more conventional ways. Similarly, for other sites in Eastern Europe that are non-concentration camp related, but are Holocaust related, such as the Anne Frank House, it has been described by people in the past as a kind of a pilgrimage, a kind of a sacred space which one goes to attend and to visit and to connect with and honor the memory of the Holocaust and the individuals who were part of that entire experience. Now, in preparing for this lecture, what I had done was I'd made a phone call to a great aunt of mine who lives in Brazil, because I knew that she had taken some time some years back to travel to Eastern Europe. And I knew that she didn't just didn't just visit the concentration camps, which some members of her extended family had been survived the war and were had their experiences, but she didn't just want to visit the concentration camps. She also wanted to visit the shtetl where her family, her parents, or her grandparents had lived, and so she went and visited and described her experience to me, and described it as one of the most powerful experiences in her life. And she had only taken this journey at the age of late 50s, early 60s. And so what I had it dawned on me, and upon reflecting on this kind of topic, is that it's not merely the sites that in Eastern Europe that directly relate to the Holocaust, such as a concentration camp site or the site of Anne Frank's house, but it's also the sites where Jews had lived for many, many years, decades, or maybe even centuries, that becomes part of this entire experience, that to honor the memory of the Holocaust and to honor what had happened and to pay your respects, it's not enough for some people to visit the site of where something terrible had taken place. It's also incredibly important and incredibly powerful to visit the places where Jewish life had once thrived. And so that brings me to my next image over here, which is not of a Jewish cemetery, but of a Jewish synagogue, which is later converted in the same shtetl, and now town, has been converted into a pub. And so for what had kind of occurred to me was that for people who are traveling to Eastern Europe, they are going to encounter different types of sites, different places where this Holocaust memory is being, where the Holocaust is being memorialized. They may visit a concentration camp where it's directly related to the Holocaust. They may visit a place such as a Jewish cemetery where their ancestors, and the town where their ancestors had lived their entire lives prior to the war, and that entire community has now been dissolved as a result of the Holocaust. And in some places, like in the case of this synagogue, the site itself makes no mention of what it once was. And so it becomes the task of the pilgrim, so to speak, of the individual Jewish person who's traveling back to Eastern Europe to uncover for themselves, to walk in the footsteps of their past family members. So this brings me to, I will just recap just very briefly what I've spoken about for unconventional number 2. So the first one we mentioned was education, how on the surface it's about education, but on a deeper level, it may be about memorializing the Holocaust as well and honoring its memory. For number 2, like we mentioned, it's not merely a matter of going to a fixed place, such as a museum, a memorial, but also to make a travel arrangement to travel far off to some faraway place and to visit these various sites, and that these places vary. And you have some places that are more connected to what actually had taken place in the Holocaust, and other places are simply connected to your personal family history, and they may be more or less accommodating for visitors to connect to. So for number 3, I want to raise, this is something that I'm sure will generate quite a bit of discussion. I know because it really hits on a lot of different points, and this has to do with literature, popular media. I'm including in this category books, whether fiction or nonfiction, and films, whether fiction or nonfiction, documentary style or popular films, are all in this category. And how, again, on the surface, this is about entertainment or about communicating ideas or about writing of a history or telling a story. But on a deeper level, I think it's really touches upon memory making and honoring memory and honoring those who have passed. And I think here you also have a degree of variety. On one hand, you have probably what is the more of this approach, of this unconventional way to memorialize the Holocaust. There is the more conventional end of it, which is writing from the point of view of Jews who had gone through the war. So I give you here 3 titles as simply examples of the many, many such memoirs that have been written, including, I'm sure, by people, some of the people by Kurt Schke have also published memoirs themselves. And this becomes a common theme for individuals who had gone through the war, as well as for the readers to connect to and to honor this memory. So we've got Anne Frank's diary. We've got Viktor Frankl, who is a psychiatrist from Vienna, who had written a book, Man's Search for Meaning. It became an incredibly well-selling, very best-selling, book of sorts. And it fits in with his psychological approach. We have Elie Wiesel, again, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, and I don't even need to mention these people in too much detail. You're all very much aware. But I want to point out this is perhaps a more conventional style, as opposed to works of fiction, and especially works of fiction that are written in a kind of a different approach, where it's no longer from the point of view of, say, the Jewish victim or the Jewish survivor. It's now taking a different point of view, and such is the case in this very popular book, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which later became a film as well. And so we get, again, a sense of this is what makes these approaches unconventional, is that there is not a set way of going about writing about the Holocaust. When it comes to a museum, we know what to expect when you go to a Holocaust museum. It's going to be literally cemented into the ground. It's going to be a building. You know what to expect. There are going to be exhibits and such. A memorial, you know what to expect with a memorial, and you know what to expect with a commemoration day. You know when it is on your calendar. When it comes to works of literature, on various different sort of written works and written accounts of the Holocaust, you will get all sorts of kinds of variety. And so I will now go to films. So here's where, again, you have, these are on the surface, the stated objective of such films these are cultural productions. They are various works of art in some sense. They are artistic works about the Holocaust, or based on actual stories, or generally inspired by events during the Holocaust. And these films obviously will make no attempt, at least some of them will make very little attempt at portraying what actually had happened. Even works that had taken place, even movies that are based on real events, the filmmakers always have the option of adding extra scenes that never really occurred in real life, because such is what a work of art is, what a movie is. It's a work of fiction, even ones based on true events. And still here you have a degree of variety between what I would consider within this approach, the more conventional end, such as Schindler's List, which is almost a prototype of what a Holocaust film should be, versus something more recently, such as Jojo Rabbit, which I'm sure will, for many people, will evoke very strong reactions either in favor or in disapproval of such a film because of its use of comedy and its approach and its emphasis on the perspective of the young German boy as opposed to taking the perspective of the Jewish child. And so here we have, and the author, rather the director and producer and one of the actors over here, the main actor, is actually a Jewish man from New Zealand, who is actually, his mother is Jewish, his father's Maori. And so even though he's Jewish personally, it takes a very different approach than to say Schindler's List, which is produced also by Steven Spielberg, another Jew. And so you have a very wide degree of variety in this sort of field, and this is what makes it unconventional. Creating Holocaust memory by way of film is not something that's fixed and has a set pattern to it. And we may feel very strongly about different films, whether they're very good or very bad, which is not the same when we approach, say, a museum, which we know what to expect. And I want to also dig just a little deeper in this topic as well. And I want to return to the case of Elie Wiesel. So Elie Wiesel's most famous Holocaust work is Night. It's a rendering of his personal experience. But like I mentioned with the approach of travel and pilgrimage, that people can travel to Eastern Europe and attend something at a concentration camp. They can go visit a concentration camp, or they can choose, or in addition, they may choose to visit the shtetl where their parents or their grandparents may have lived, and to try to reconnect with that past. And so too I see within Elie Wiesel's own works this kind of divergence, where his work Night is the more classical approach, telling about his story about the Holocaust, but he has other works in which, in these two cases, Souls on Fire, Somewhere a Master, and other works very similar, where he wants to honor the memory of the Hasidic shtetl, where he had grown up. He was part of the Viznitz Hasidic community, and his parents and grandparents were part of this Hasidic community. And so to honor the memory of his community, he wants to not only write about how this community was destroyed in the war, he wants to offer you an insight into how the community lived prior. And so he's got many such works on this topic as well. And so again, we see that what makes these approaches unconventional is that, firstly, to remind everyone that on the surface, these books are about telling a very particular story. But underneath it, I think there is a program of honoring the Holocaust as well. And I think many of you may agree with this on just at face value. But again, there's a degree of variety and a degree of difference in these different approaches. Okay, so this takes us to, I believe this is, by my count, is number 4. Study, theology, scholarship. Again, similar theme. On the surface, study, theology, scholarship, all these kinds of things. There are many books written and many talks being given, including this talk itself falls under this category. It's on its surface. I'm trying to communicate ideas to you, and you're here to pick up information. But I would argue that at the same time, we are also honoring the memory of those who had gone through the Holocaust. And this approach also has a variety of different ways about it. You have scholars who write about the Holocaust in terms of a historical perspective or social historical perspective. Other people take a theological stance. Other people are very concerned with what does the question of the Holocaust mean for Jews or even non-Jews in terms of great theological questions. Can you understand religion and human morality differently after the Holocaust, after Auschwitz, becomes a great question in the Jewish religion as well as for other religions as well. And it's not just those, sorry, I'll preface this slide just a second. So for individuals who are scholars and those who are reading such works, if you are, let's say, a researcher on the Holocaust, either as a writing for Holocaust studies, historical perspective, or you're a theologian and you're writing such books from a theological perspective, and you're spending days, weeks, months, maybe years, maybe your entire lifetime on this topic, I would argue that it's no longer a matter of you writing down for the sake of acquiring information, I would argue that for many people who are involved in this sort of work, and this may seem intuitive to some of you in the audience, and you may agree as well, is that it's not merely about acquiring information and writing down information and sharing information. There's a process of honoring the memory as well. And you'll probably find a lot of an indication of this, say if you take a look at many of these books, let's say in the introduction or the preface or the dedication page, you'll see that what has motivated the individuals to write such books, it very much has to do with Holocaust memory. And so, and in this next slide, this is a book which I would be very curious if anyone here in the audience today remembers when this study came out and when the so-called Milgram experiments or the shock experiments, the electric shock experiments, which the social psychologist Stanley Milgram had utilized in order to study what he called obedience to authority. If they recall, at that time, if there was an immediate and obvious connection between how this information, which on its surface is about human psychology, and how much of it was connected with an ongoing debate following the war about the nature of human beings. And so just to briefly summarize why I am including this book in this conversation. So the social psychologist Stanley Milgram, I don't recall the exact date he published this work, but I believe it's 1970s or 1980s, around then. So he had decided to, or 60s, and he decided to craft an experiment to test the willingness of an individual to listen to a person in authority, no matter what the consequences were. And so what he does is he has an experimenter, the researcher, the psychologist who's testing the individual, who has the controls to a shock machine, an electric shock machine, and he has an actor on the other side of a wall pretending to be shocked every single time the test subject is pressing a button or turning on a switch. And so no one's being harmed in the process. This obviously is how psychological tests have to occur. Oh, thank you. I see Esther Madar's Stanford 70s. Well, thank you for that. So the reason why I've included this slide in is because I believe that Stanley Milgram wanted to answer the question of how come the German people had simply followed orders, followed instructions during the war. And so this became the motivation behind this experiment. And furthermore, the question of Milgram's experiments is something that still resonates today for psychologists and other researchers who even today, 30, 40 years later, however many decades later, people are still studying and trying to replicate this experiment because they're still haunted by the same question that Stanley Milgram had, which was, how could people do such a thing? And so on the surface, this is simply a work of psychology. This is simply a psychological experiment. But perhaps latently, on a deeper level, there's something else happening. There's a way in which it's not enough for some people to simply say, I need to remember what had happened, but they want to try to respond to the Holocaust in various other kinds of ways. And in this case, it's kind of transformed into a work of psychology. Okay, and for my last approach, I want to kind of reflect on how the old and unconventional ways, and I'll put that in scare quotes, so what is so-called the conventional ways that we mentioned at the start, which was museums, memorials, and commemorative days, which seem to be very fixed and very conventional. There's still something new happening even within these different approaches. So for museums, I don't want to get too much into this particular topic, but just to say that when looking at some of the research, there's a lot of interest on the part of curators to ensure something new is happening in the museum exhibits. It's not enough anymore curators know. It's not enough anymore for individuals to walk through a Holocaust museum and to simply acquire information about the Holocaust. They want something else to occur. They want something new and something different from what normally one expects from a museum, a non-Holocaust museum, for example, that in a Holocaust museum, it becomes responsibility almost on the part of the museum staff, the museum curator, and others to craft something new. So for example, one aspect of walking away, one question that curators want to know that is being studied today is, what's the message we want people to walk away with? Not simply that something had happened a long time ago, but also that something in their life must change. And so this focus on action is atypical if one considers the Holocaust Museum against a backdrop of all other kinds of museums. No one walks into, let's say, an air and space museum with a kind of an assumption on the part of, say, the curator or the visitor that when they finish walking through the entire museum, that they're now going to take up some sort of social action at the end. As opposed to, for Holocaust museums, it's now become almost an expectation on the part of curators that we want people to really change their behavior at the end. And this is now new. Similar with memorials, memorials are now being designed, again, with this kind of thing in mind, that it's no longer enough to put up a monument in the memory of those who had perished, but we also want people to walk away with a certain kind of, a different sort of experience. And I'll give you an example that's close to home. And some of you might be in the audience here today who may know very intimately about this example, how a school here in New South Wales had created a memorial garden to commemorate the victims of the Holocaust. And this was invited Courage to Care to open this memorial as well. So I kind of want to contrast the difference between this memorial garden and say what would be a conventional Holocaust memorial. So, or a conventional war memorial of any kind. So typically a war memorial usually involves the local government or state government to set aside funds and to set aside a site and to involve lots of different planning processes and to have you know, a various some kind of budget and some kind of consultation with the local community and a whole very long formal process in order to create what is essentially a simple physical artifact upon which we now are going to project the entire memory of whatever it is that we're trying to commemorate. In this kind of instance, we have something that's kind of develops quite differently. So it develops out of a school. It's not a local government. There was no extensive planning, I think, involved, at least compared to setting aside a particular site in the way that a local government or a state government might do. And also, was there extensive community consultation with the local Jewish community in order to establish this memorial garden in a Catholic school somewhere in New South Wales? I don't think so. So again, we have something unconventional happening in the old conventional way. This brings me to, I think, what is you'll see the most degree of change in terms of commemoration days. So, like we said at the start, what makes a commemoration day for honoring the Holocaust conventional is because it's fixed. It's fixed in time, one set day of the year, and we know more or less what to expect when we attend such commemorations. But is it really fixed in time that we can all agree with to say it is at one place in time? So over here, I present to you 3 different dates which various people around the world commemorate the Shoah. So one is the 27th of January, which is the designated day set aside by the United Nations and many countries around the world to commemorate what had happened during the Holocaust. There's Yom HaShoah, which takes place in April, May each year. That is the day of choice for Jewish communities and the state of Israel, and also to some degree the United States and Canada also, they kind of aligned their commemoration days around that time of the year. Then there is Tisha B'Av, the 9th, sorry, I wrote the 3rd of Av, it should be the 9th of Av. So the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, which comes to be around July and August. Now this is the day of choice for some Orthodox Jews who, because they feel uncomfortable with the what they see as an appropriation of Holocaust memory on the part of the state of Israel, and they're, let's say, to say politely, they're not so Zionistic, or they're not very enthusiastic about the Zionist project. And so for them, they want Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, which is a traditional day in the Judaism where you commemorate. Oh, someone mentions, yes, Jillian, you mentioned about Kristendom. Yes, that too. So again, this only furthers my claim that there's a degree of variety when it comes to commemoration of the Shoah. So what I'm pointing out here is that it's not so fixed in time, because we would assume if, let's say, we came from a different planet and we landed on planet Earth and we knew that there was a great momentous event in human history, which people are setting aside one day during the year to commemorate, we would assume that it would be a universally accepted single day. But no, there are several. And furthermore, for some countries, I've discovered, especially it seems to be the case for many European countries, is they have chosen other such dates that have nothing to do with the past list we mentioned. So I'm not going to read the entire list, but only to point out that these are 9 European countries who offer individual dates that don't overlap with the other dates we mentioned, that extend from March all the way through October. So what is happening here, you might ask? Why is it that these countries are choosing these dates? Or is it a kind of in opposition to what is the accepted dates for most other people? Or is it because these particular dates mean something to them? I would suspect that for some countries, it may be for various, it may be, various motivations for various countries. Okay, so, and again, there's also something that I'm sure many of you here are aware about, a custom, at least in Israel, where there's the siren goes off and people get out, stand out of their cars, and this becomes like a thing that people kind of notice. I don't know when it first started. Maybe someone here can share that if they are aware of when this kind of custom started. But again, there's something unconventional happening on what is a conventional, traditional way of doing things. And you may view these kind of unconventional aspects either positively or negatively. You may say positively, oh, look how wonderful it is that the entire country stops for a moment. Or you may view it kind of negatively and say, well, if you really want to respect what had happened all this time ago, and you really think it's important to honor and respect what had happened, then you shouldn't be doing this on the road with your engine running. You should take aside some time and go to a communal space, a public space, whether it's religious or it's secular or it's communal or whatever it is, but find an appropriate place and time to commemorate such memory. So again, there's a degree of variety, and just like we saw when it came to popular films and those other examples I mentioned earlier, there's no singular set way of approaching this. And I'll leave you with one more example. So this is something that I know Courage to Care was involved with a few years back, and many of you here may have participated as well. So the Zikaron B'Salon, this is something that's also, it's taking a different approach to say the get out of your car in the middle of the street in order to mark some sort of honoring of memory, but this is more formal. But again, it's different because it's not in an established set communal place. This is done, quote, in the living room. So I'll leave those 5 at that. And I want to turn to a kind of a deeper read and a deeper reflection on these topics. So you may wonder, and I think justifiably you may wonder, why do people whether in the Jewish community or elsewhere, why is there such a need for these new approaches to Holocaust memory? Why can't they just be satisfied with what is accepted, which is we build memorials, we build monuments, we build museums, we put quite a lot of investment as a community collectively. We put quite a lot of effort into these approaches, whether it's a museum, a memorial, or a commemoration day. There's a lot of thought behind these processes. Why is there such a need, it seems, to do all these other approaches? And so I want to kind of point to something about the memory making process that is when it comes to Holocaust memory, and that is there's an aspect of healing that takes place, and this is something that I'm sure many of you may easily be able to explain, perhaps way better than me, in terms of the healing process that is linked to the memorialization of the Holocaust or any other kind of event. And so from what I would suggest here is that the collective memory that is being honored and memorialized during these various different ways, conventional or unconventional, are all a single response, one giant response to the collective trauma of the Holocaust. And the question is why the unconventional versus conventional, and it has to do with the fact that it is a collective act that is going on. It is a collective trauma and a collective memory. And because it is a collective, it's not going to be so neat and tidy that all of us can agree on a singular approach. And in terms of trauma itself and the concept of a collective trauma, well, I put this photo up because this is around the time when the concept of trauma becomes accepted by psychologists and medical experts that trauma is a real thing. So this is in following the Vietnam War. It's actually in the year 1980 when the DSM, the Manual for the Psychologists and Psychiatrists, officially records PTSD as an actual disorder. As an actual, the trauma can affect people long term. And it's, to me, when I first heard about that fact, that it took up to the year 1980 for psychologists to officially recognize post-traumatic stress disorder, I was shocked. I thought surely they came across this concept earlier on. And they did, but they didn't think of it so universally. And this is where the Holocaust comes in. So prior to 1980, prior to the year when psychologists generally universally agreed that trauma can affect people in a long term, and as such, people need to have the correct supports and treatment for it. Immediately after the war, immediately after World War II, there were psychologists who recognized that something obviously was different about the experiences of the war that you cannot ignore. And so rather than calling it post-traumatic stress, which is a concept that a term they wouldn't coin for quite some time, they came up with a term called concentration camp syndrome, which is perhaps more an ominous kind of a label. But this is the term that they came up with, and the term that psychologists and psychiatrists and other medical experts were using for decades after the war. And it wasn't something that only a few people had studied. This is something that many, many people had studied. I came across a book that the entire purpose of the book, again, this is pre the internet age, the entire purpose of the book, it was simply to catalog all of the research on the psychological and medical effects of the Holocaust on survivors. And so it's a massive body of research. A lot of work it was put into trying to understand this. And along the way, the psychologists and psychiatrists and other researchers, they kind of stumble on this notion of collective trauma because they realize that it's not simply an event that affects the individual, it's something that affects the people around them. And of course, survivors and survivors' families and the Jewish community probably knew about this idea before the researchers. And I'd probably say almost certainly so that they knew about these effects before the researchers kind of had to figure it out through their process, the research process. and it basically, the concept of intergenerational trauma, for those who are not familiar with, is simply that one individual experiences a trauma, and that trauma, the effects of that trauma can be seen in the behaviors and other conditions of this person's life, but not only that person's life, but in the lives of their children and grandchildren. We don't really know too much about it because this is still very a new topic, and the researchers are still trying to struggle with this concept. But along with intergenerational trauma, there is collective trauma, in which to some degree the community around these individuals or communities that identify very strongly with the events that have taken place have all been affected by it. And so I would argue that as part of, because this is an experience of the Holocaust that affects different people in different ways, I think it would seem natural for us to think that, well, quite clearly, if it affects all of us in different ways, we cannot expect that we all will really agree with one particular approach as a response. And also, another thing that the researchers do note is that the responses to trauma, traditionally, I don't know how loosely we may use this word, but how psychologists would normally understand responses to trauma involves an individual going to seek therapy. But then at some point they recognized that the therapy wasn't really doing it. It wasn't up to task for people who had gone through the Holocaust. And there are various explanations why therapy wasn't enough for these people, or didn't at all help. And instead, the Jewish people as a whole had figured out a different approach. Rather than individuals go and seeking therapy, as a community, as a collective, we use all these various different ways to heal ourselves, essentially. So I'll leave you with a question, which is, do these new and unconventional ways diminish the meaning of this memory process, of this memory project? And you may argue personally either yes or no, or somewhere in between. But I think related to this, I have a short Hasidic story, which I think kind of connects very strongly to what we're talking about here. And this, I'll tell you the story, but I'm just putting the text up here so I can read the notes myself, just very briefly. So this is a Hasidic story that I've titled The Fire in the Woods. It involves the founder of the Hasidic movement, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, who lived about 250 years ago. He became aware that a big tragedy was going to occur for the Jewish people. And so as a response, he went to a particular place in the forest where he lit kind of a special fire, and he recited a very particular prayer. And as a result, so the legend goes, the Jewish people were saved from this threat. But the legend continues. Later, the Baal Shem Tov's disciple, the Maggid of Mezrich, Rabbi Dovi of Mezrich, he was faced with a similar sort of threat. So he went to the same place in the forest where his teacher had gone. But over here, he is forced to speak to God and to plead with him, to say, Master of the universe, I don't know how to light this special sacred fire, but I still know how to recite this special prayer. And again, there was a miracle accomplished. The Jewish people were saved. Later still, a disciple of the Maggid, so this is now third generation, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasov, he's faced with the same sort of predicament. He goes to the forest to plead with God, and he says, I don't know how to light the fire, and I don't even know the words of this prayer, but I know the place. I can find the place, and this has to be enough. And again, the miracle is accomplished. And now we're at the last chapter. It's again a later disciple, Rabbi Yisrael of Rajin, who again is faced with a similar sort of predicament. And he says to God, well, I don't know how to light the fire, and I don't know how to say the prayer, and I don't even know the location in the woods, but I know the story, and so the story will have to be sufficient. And so that I think connects very much with what we've just talked about, that as the generations go on, as new generations of Jews are raised and they approach the same sort of dilemma. How do we honor the Holocaust memory? Things are inevitably going to change. Thank you very much, and we can probably turn it to questions. I'll stop sharing in just a second.
Can I ask a question?
Yep, sure.
I'm Eddie Bowers.
Yes.
I'm a Holocaust survivor. I've written a book about my life. I've had some experience, and I really appreciated your talk. I think it was excellent. Thank you very much. But I've had some experiences with some of the things you said about. I believe every Jew has a story, the survivor, the grandchild, the child. And I believe that survivors, and there are not many of us left. I was a young child from the day I was born in January till 5 years old when I was liberated. I was in Bergen-Belsen in Westerbork in a lost train, but I won't talk about that. So I believe all the survivors today should put in writing. I'm not a believer in historians and scientists who can talk about what they've heard or what they've read. What I'm finding, I will leave that to last, and I won't bore you too much. You talk about personal trauma. I believe most Jewish people who survive the concentration camp go through personal trauma, and each and every one is different from the other. I've met plenty of them all over the world. I've spoken all over the world, including the USA, Australia. The point, I think, is about personal trauma. Everybody is different. The Dutch government here in Sydney sent me to a psychiatrist. And after half an hour, 20 minutes, whatever, the psychiatrist, I don't know why they sent you to me. Because I've blocked the war out of my mind. And she did a test on me and said, that can happen. One point I've been experiencing is the interest of actually Jewish people in the history of the Holocaust by a story from survivors. I have spoken at a number of schools here in Sydney. Only one was Jewish. I have spoken at functions, presentations. Only one was Jewish. And what I'm finding with the audiences, and especially the non-Jewish schools, schools like Vaucluse, which is a well-known school, Bellevue Hill, the audience was all non-Jewish, the kids. And the questions they ask are more interesting and relevant than the questions the adults ask. When I'm finding out, in my experience over the last few years since I've written my book, the Jewish organizations, I've written to many of them. Only one or two responded, not even a courtesy of a no, thank you. And I find that interesting. So now I'm concentrating on non-Jewish. I do all my own promotions and things like that. I've spoken in New York, Washington, LA, was due to speak in Europe, but COVID. So what I'm finding is that the Jewish people of the second generation onwards are not as interested in the Holocaust. That's just my comments.
Yeah. Look, I feel like because I've talked for so long, and I actually do want to hear what other people have to say, so I'll try to keep my responses very brief. But definitely there is a lot of study on the differences between the first generation, second generation, third generation, their responses to it. And also some of the research sometimes will surprise you, because what we encounter personally and through our own experience in the community is sometimes different from what the researchers do, is if they try to uncover a little bit of what are the motivations behind why, say, for many survivors, they didn't talk about, the war for the first, 30 or so years. following, and the second generation, how they reacted to that. It's a massive, massive body of literature, like I mentioned earlier, and we can talk endlessly about it. But thank you, definitely, thank you for sharing those thoughts, and I'm sure other people have a lot more to say. And again, I say on behalf of Courage to Care, we're very lucky to have you involved, and we welcome you. So pay no attention to those who ignore you. If anyone else has, we've got Simone, we've got Anna Wolf, if you can help with the flow of questions and answers.
Okay, Simone, do you want to unmute yourself?
Thank you so much, firstly, for this opportunity. I'm in Melbourne, and I am a coordinator of donations in order to send secondary teachers, which you're well aware of course, to Yad Vashem. And unfortunately, it's been stifled by COVID at the moment. But I want to say, in response to what Eddie just was saying, and that is that the majority, when you talk about a representation of the teachers who are interested in furthering their Holocaust education to their students, we're talking secondary students, the majority of the teachers are non-Jewish, but there are some Jewish teachers amongst them. And I would suggest that that is a representation of the size of the Jewish community in relation to the general community, that, you know, you can't have 10 out of 30 Jewish teachers going to Yad Vashem to study. And these are all dedicated Holocaust educators. So that's one thing. And also, amongst the teachers that we sponsor to Yad Vashem, there are Jewish teachers who are teaching Holocaust in non-Jewish schools. And that's not just in Melbourne, but I just wanted to bring that up because it's just another aspect of Holocaust education. So thank you for this opportunity very much.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's quite a landscape of this entire field, you could say. I want to just quickly respond to some of the comments because I know that they were written earlier, and so I feel like they perhaps, as a courtesy, should be responded to first in line, so to speak. So in the chat, we've got a comment from Lily about intergenerational effects being well represented. Sorry, is it intergenerational effects well represented in the writing of Lily Brett? Yeah, so it's a lot of written on intergenerational effects. What's interesting to me is how intergenerational trauma is now a concept that is understood not just Holocaust related. For many people in Australia, if you say the term intergenerational trauma, their first immediate association will be about Aboriginal people. So, and I think that there is a lot of, like I mentioned with earlier with the involvement, the founding of PTSD in response to the Vietnam War, that various different sorts of traumas contribute to the overall question of trauma and healing. So in this sense, there is a wider conversation and a wider field of work being done, not just Holocaust related. We got a comment from Denise about giving acknowledgement to survivors. So I'm not sure if this is a comment about...
Can I just expand on that, please,
Yeah.
Dovi? Thank you very much for your sharing today. One of the concerns I have is that whilst it's important that we pay respects, and I'm speaking from Gadigal country and I work extensively in the Aboriginal community, one of the things that I think also needs to happen within the Jewish community is the same thing. The same speech that is given needs to be given like Courage to Care starting or at the start of schools. You know, it doesn't have to be every day, but I think it's really important because what it's doing now is we are being respectful across, you know, the wider community. And I think the same respect could happen back to us. We still have some survivors and we certainly have children. I don't know the wording yet. I'm happy to work with you to create some wording, but I really think it's very important. It needs to be in schools the same as the others are. And that's something I'm, you know, I do it myself when I'm running sessions, but I think it's really important that we as a collective need to consider how that respect could also be paid.
I love that. I love that. Let me let me rephrase that for everyone else here in case to kind of restate what you're saying, at least how I understand it. So I think what you're suggesting is the same way how it has become the custom and a kind of an appropriate custom on the part of many people in Australia, that when they gather together for various sorts of purposes, whether a lecture or otherwise, that they get up and they say, well, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. That becomes a way to formally acknowledge what had happened in Australia's past. Well, we should have a similar sort of acknowledgement. Exactly how it's used and when it's used, we can obviously, the Jewish people collectively can figure this out eventually. But it's I think a wonderful, I would even say an ingenious concept to say, here's something that works in another culture and that has been now transmitted. It's not Aboriginal people saying the acknowledgement to country. This is non-Aboriginal people saying an acknowledgement to country. Well, why don't we sort of promote something similar like that? So yeah, again, this can be an entire project onto its own, and I would be happy to see you promote this, and not just in terms of a single comment at the end of a lecture, but to carry this conversation forward. Let's go. I know there's a lot of people waiting, so let's
Thank you.
move on. Yeah, we've got.
Judy Lee has a question. If you want to unmute yourself, Judy. Judy, you're still on mute, sorry.
Sorry, Judy, you're still on mute.
Yes, thanks so much for an erudite and absolutely inspirational talk. Mine's not so much a question, but just, well, I have so many questions. I could talk on forever and ask you everything. But with Jojo Rabbit you mentioned, I found it quite offensive. But there was a Mel Brooks film, and it was sort of like Springtime for Hitler in Germany. It was an absolute parody. And if anybody could see that film, it was quite brilliant. I just want to say that. And as far as a sort of a talk for, sort of the survivors, not a talk, but a memorial type. Anyway, I think that would be a marvellous idea. I'm only a survivor of life, not from anything else. Sort of about fourth generations here. So, but thank you once again. It was just that Mel Brooks film. We can get hold of that for people. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Judy. It's like I said, the Jojo Rabbit. You can. I can understand its appeal if you're, let's say, an educator and you want, let's say, non-Jewish children to better connect, and they've read about Anne Frank's diary, and they may have seen The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, and this becomes another tool in that arsenal for, I think, a non-Jewish audience as opposed to a Jewish audience. I don't see how, a Jewish child or other Jewish audience can watch that film the same way as a non-Jewish audience. That there's just so much immediate, like when I saw it, I made sure to see it because I heard the reviews were marvelous. But I was wondering, why isn't there more, the character, the Jewish child's character, why isn't that more explored? Instead, she becomes this side character and there's not much about her. But again, I take your point.
Thank you.
Eva Engel, I believe you raised your hand with a question. If you would like to unmute.
Hello, can you hear us? No. Now,
Yes.
I'd really like to know and hear further about the lady with the Indigenous suggestion. She spoke just a minute ago, and Dovi was saying we should promote that more. Who is that? Who is the person, and what area did she cover?
Yes, that's Denise. Maybe we'll connect you after the meeting and you guys can discuss, because I know I'm you know what, my hunch is that if the two of you connect after this meeting, something good will come out of it.
Yeah, is she a teacher?
Again, let's why don't we keep
all right,
it
later. Yes, please.
Yeah,
I'm an educationalist, Eva, with a long history, and I work extensively in the Aboriginal community. Yes, I'm a teacher.
You're a teacher in a Jewish school. Doesn't matter. I'll talk to her later.
Vera Dunn, I think you just raised your hand.
Hello, everyone, and thanks very much, Dovi. That's great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, excellent. Yes, I think our educational role is terribly important for the wider community, but I'm particularly concerned about our own Jewish youth, Jewish university students, Jewish high school students. So therefore the commemoration, the role of commemoration, and to my mind is incredibly important. A regular fixed dates in addition to the World Holocaust Day in January, the liberation of Auschwitz, but the Yom HaShoah and the fact that it's tied together with Yom Ha'atzmaut, I think is fabulous. I fully appreciate that very Orthodox people feel that we've got that we've already got commemoration within the religious calendar of a number of traumas and Holocaust-like events throughout our history, but this is so important, and there's just so much happening and misinformation out there, and a lot of our Jewish youth, especially what we read about what's going on in American campuses, and to a lesser extent happening on Australian campuses, that our kids are just so concerned with doing the right thing, to kunalam, to practically everyone else except ourselves. So to keep reminding them that, you know, what the Jewish people have survived and have been stubborn enough for the last 2,000 years to keep surviving. So I think that we have to keep putting a very strong emphasis on these regular dates and commemorations within our own community as well. Just that's really all. It's my opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. I see Julianne.
Julianne.
A couple of comments for Dovi and Vera, I guess also. There are a lot of things happening at the moment with Youth Here is an organisation for university students that is doing a lot of work around that. They're also doing some intergenerational work with that as well. I'm a representative of Courage to Clear on the Shoah Committee of the Jewish Board of Deputies, and they also have been doing some work with them as well. Zikaron L'B'Salom, as Dovi said, is also doing work. Together for Humanity is also doing work. As a parent and a grandparent, one of my issues is all three of my children went to a Jewish school. Now, everybody don't jump on me. I know what half of you are going to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. My three girls, who are the grandchildren of a Holocaust survivor, and many people I know whose children went to a Jewish day school, were Jewish out. They had it up to here, they left school, they didn't want to know until they themselves started to have children. Yet I have friends whose children have gone to a non-Jewish school with BJE teachers and whatever, and they're far more interested because they didn't hear it day in and day out, over and over again. So my girls are now in their mid-40s, they're now starting to come back. That's the generation, Eddie, that you're talking about, that we need to grab a hold of to keep the message going.
Talk to her. You want to say something?
Yeah, thank you, Julianne, for that. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. I'm afraid that we won't be able to get to more people. I see Peter's got a question. If you can unmute yourself, Peter.
Peter, unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. My question to you, arising out of the title for your talk, was about different ways of teaching or remembering the Holocaust. Now, as a facilitator for Courage to Care, I'd like to hear from a practical viewpoint, what are the different methods you suggest for teaching and remembering the Holocaust, given that we have to communicate that to various school kids and others, compared to what we're currently doing?
Yeah, that is a great question about what the implications are for a program or for like an organization such as Courage to Care, or really
The Yiddish part.
yeah, the Jewish community in general. Look, I think some suggestions that come out immediately could be, and I'm just freestyling here, so pardon me if these seem unpolished a little bit, is that of the 5 different elements that I've mentioned, whether it's popular media, travel, education, whatever they are, the point is to get a different part of yourself involved, not simply the part of you that, let's say bodily, so your body itself. When it comes to a museum, you're expected to walk a certain amount of steps, to physically move a certain amount of steps. In a classroom, you're expected not to do that. So the question is, all right, if we just look at just the human body in relation to commemorating something, what is the best way? I don't think there is a best way, but I think there are different ways. So for example, when it comes to travel and pilgrimage, that topic I mentioned earlier, that I would imagine requires quite a bit of movement, because you're not only walking around, say, a particular place, a concentration camp or some shtetl or whatever it is, but you're also expected in that moment that's not something that you can just do willy-nilly. You have to book a flight in advance and take quite an effort involved. So the question is, what sort of preparation can be done ahead of time for an educational program like Courage to Care, that it's not simply to go from regular classroom activities to suddenly talking about the Holocaust. If you want to make it really special, there has to be something in between. You have to take the people sort of on some sort of journey, even if you can't be, even if you're not free to move about the classroom as much as you can.
So what is the answer to the question?
So I would say that—
I know what the question is, but
yes.
What's the answer?
So my suggestion would be that some sort of preparation involving guiding the children at a cognitive level as opposed to a material level, instead of telling them to physically, maybe even to physically tell them to get up and walk out, or maybe these sort of programs need to be done outside in the schoolyard, or depending on the campus you have. You have to be able to change things up. But look, I don't want to be prescriptive and to say this is what you must do. All my intention here is to complicate what we think of things like educational programs as not being just about education. Yeah, and again, I'm happy to speak with you more out of this session. I think you're on to something, definitely. If we have other comments or questions, I see we've got a comment over here from Vicky about a book worth reading. It's actually from one of the former facilitators of Courage to Care, called Let Me Whisper You My Story. It's specifically addressed to children. That's, again, an example. I think from what I've heard about it previously, and from what, Vicky, you're writing about here, is that this is trying to address that problem. If we're trying to write a fictional work for children who we'll assume are not all Jewish, then you want to make sure that it's done cleverly and done in a way that they can relate to it. Looks like that this book might be an example of that. Okay, so I'm conscious of the time that we've gone over our 60 minutes, but I'm happy to stay on for a little bit longer if there's more questions or more comments or that sort of thing.
Are there any more questions from anybody?
Lots of comments.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming this afternoon, and a very, very big thank you to Dovi for your professionalism this afternoon. A wonderful presentation, fascinating topic, very thought-provoking. I think we'll all agree we can't have a narrow view on ways of remembering the Holocaust. There are so many different ways to go forward with this topic, and all the ways that you've presented this afternoon, Dovi, have merit. Thank you everyone for attending. Be well, keep safe, enjoy this beautiful spring sunshine, and please come again to future presentations. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
You can unmute and clap.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Great time.
Is
Good
Denise
to see
in-
everyone.
Are you in Sydney, Denise?
I am, Eva. I put my number in the chat for you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye, Kathy. Nice to see you.